I have spent a lot of time recently watching Star Trek: The Next Generation, including episodes I'd never seen before.
Nerdrotic.com.
I was hoping against hope we would get, at the very least, some mediocre Star Trek from Star Trek Picard. I would take your garden variety Voyager or Enterprise episode at this point, considering what we have gotten in the last couple of years with Star Trek Disgracery. Unfortunately, those hopes, which weren't that high to begin with, were completely crushed, pulverized, atomized by Sir Patrick Stewart himself in a Variety article that came out today that we will go over. But before we get started, I would like to ask you to please consider subscribing to the channel and liking and sharing the videos. This is the only way independent creators like yours truly and Robert Meyer Burnett can remain competitive against the giant corporations that YouTube has decided to prioritize on this platform. I thank you to all who have subscribed, and I thank you for your continued support. First, we need to do a little catching up because it's been a while since I've done a Star Trek Picard video. Actually, since last summer when I attended the Star Trek convention. It had almost 5,000 people there, and almost 300 of them were under the age of 40. Since last summer, Star Trek Picard has lost its showrunner. The test screenings have been horrific, according to my insiders, and there has been multiple reshoots. Does this sound familiar? It should, and it'll probably have a very similar result. But made worse is what Patrick Stewart said in this article, and I find it very disappointing and a tad unprofessional. And I know he's almost 80 and there's no fucks to give at that point, and I respect that. Unfortunately, it looks like we're going down the same road as we did with Star Trek Discovery. Unfortunately, Alex Kurtzman's name is on this, making it a virtual impossibility for this show to be good. The same Alex Kurtzman who said he was more of a Star Wars guy than a Star Trek guy. The same Alex Kurtzman who directed The Mummy. The same Alex Kurtzman who failed with the Amazing Spider-Man franchise and the Universal Monsters franchise. That Alex Kurtzman who just wants a franchise. He doesn't care what it is, and he doesn't care about the canon, the lore, or the fandom. And unfortunately, Patrick Stewart doesn't care either, because if he did, he wouldn't be making some of the creative decisions he is making with the character of Jean-Luc Picard, willing to sacrifice him on the altar of current year, or in this case, last year, agenda. And as we've witnessed the fall of Skywalker and the Disney Star Wars reckoning, and as we are currently witnessing a reckoning with Doctor Who. In the case of the fall of Skywalker, they had a $2 billion movie that they made a $1 billion movie, and it barely made that. And while it still made money, it wasn't nearly what they were expecting when they embarked on the Disney Star Wars trilogy. And as far as Doctor Who is concerned, we've seen a 57% drop in ratings from Series 11 to Series 12, and it's probably going to get worse. Is all of this sounding familiar? And unfortunately, as has been the case for quite some time, Alex Kurtzman, the poser, the person who was in charge of Kurtzman Trek, is behind the times. And he is still running things like it's 2015. And unfortunately, Star Trek Picard is going to suffer the same fate. And yes, they have done current year politics in Star Trek before, like with Unification, but that required talent. We don't have that here with Star Trek Picard and Star Trek Discovery. If Naren Shankar, Ronald D. Moore, Mark Zickery, Seth MacFarlane were writing Star Trek Picard, I'd be confident we'd be getting good Star Trek. But we're talking about Alex Kurtzman, the writer and the director of The Mummy. Yes, we are also talking about Michael Chabon, who felt so strongly about his work on this series that he left the show before it even aired. Star Trek Picard, Patrick Stewart on why he returned to the final frontier, and this is going to be final, my friends. Now, the first half of this article is just Patrick Stewart's biography, and we all know how great he is. We all know his resume. We all know he grew up poor, but let's face it, He hasn't been poor in a long time, but there's a reason they put that in the article, and I will tell you that reason later. On January 23rd, CBS All Access will debut Star Trek Picard, a series in which Stewart reprises the thoughtful, cultured, bald starship captain he played for 7 years on Star Trek The Next Generation, and in a string of 4 feature films that ended in 2002. The new story is different from its predecessor in nearly every respect: texture, tone, format, production value, even the likelihood of characters dropping an F-bomb. That's all by design. Stewart's design. How many Star Trek books has Patrick Stewart written? None. How many convention appearances has he made prior to the one last summer? None. Because he doesn't care about this character. If William Shatner had some creative say about a Kirk TV show, I would be interested. He is uninterested in repeating himself, says Alex Kurtzman, the show's creator and executive producer and the mastermind behind CBS's effort to not just revive Star Trek, but also transform it into a vast narrative universe in the Marvel mold. Everything he does is filled with innate energy. He fights for the things he believes in, and he's very willing to collaborate once you're on the same wavelength. Wonder what that wavelength is. Well, how successful has Alex Kurtzman been getting franchises off the ground? He had a Marvel mold one called Spider-Man. He couldn't do that, and it's really hard to F up Spider-Man, by the way. You have to be really bad at your job. And the Universal Monsters didn't do that well either, probably because Alex Kurtzman knows dick about either of those, about as much as he knows about Star Trek. And here's some more evidence that the access media, including the once great Variety, have completely outlived their usefulness because they've become tools of the corporations, just PR firms. Let's crap on previous Star Trek. Again, this is by design. Lo-fi and a little quaint by today's standards, The Next Generation was the most successful of any Star Trek television series. The original, starring William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, was poorly rated and canceled by NBC after 3 seasons. So they had to get in that dig at the original series, and they had to call The Next Generation, the predecessor for Star Trek Picard, as quaint. The show raked in Emmy nominations, minted money for Paramount Television, and grew a massive following attracted to the unlikely figure of Stewart's Picard, a Frenchman with a posh English accent who sips tea, reads the classics, and prizes duty and honor and friendship. The Next Generation presented a humanist future in which issues like poverty, race, and class have long been sorted out, and conflicts are more often resolved through negotiation and problem solving than at the point of a phaser pistol. Stewart had no desire to go there again, because in these hyper-divisive times, we don't need something that's healing as Star Trek used to be. We don't need something that's inspiring, because Hollywood wants to remind us that everything is bad right now because they are having a giant collective temper tantrum. Unfortunately, Hollywood is much too jaded to write anything inspiring, especially the subversive hacks from Bad Reboot and Secret Hideout. I think what we're trying to say is important, he says. The world of The Next Generation doesn't exist anymore. I'm sorry, the futuristic, hopeful, inspiring world of The Next Generation doesn't exist anymore because you are talentless hacks and you don't know how to write it. And yes, I'm including you, Sir Patrick Stewart. Damn, this is disappointing. Nothing is really safe. Nothing is really secure. Are you comparing it to the late 80s when The Next Generation premiered? You know, the end of the Cold War? Yeah, that was really safe and secure. And remember, science fiction, a genre Stewart had little use for before he became one of its major figures. It wasn't until his last X-Men exploit, starring in 2017 with Hugh Jackman in director James Mangold's Logan, that he imagined a return to Picard could be desirable. And part of the reason is, and this is according to my insiders, so take it with a grain of salt, that Star Trek Picard is basically a ripoff of Logan. Again, some of the language in this article smells like it had some of Sir Patrick Stewart's and CBS's creative input. Hugh and I were so thrilled when the last thing we did for X-Men was Logan, he says. It was the best X-Men experience we both had because we were the same characters, but their world had been blown apart. The Next Generation didn't end like that. In fact, our last movie, Nemesis, was pretty weak. Partially because you had some creative input in it, Sir Patrick Stewart. Released in 2002, Nemesis lost money for Paramount, but Jar Jar Abrams' 2009 film, reimagining Kirk and Spock, now played by Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto, used to be played by Zachary Quinto and Chris Pine. We are not going to see another film with those guys in it. Cleared a path for CBS to revive the franchise for TV. Kurtzman and Brian Fuller's Star Trek Discovery, very interesting wording there. A prequel that the original series would become the cornerstone of streaming service CBS All Access. By the way, I have some viewing figures for you. Star Trek Discovery has been airing for free on the air in the UK. Mind you, this was season 1, but a lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, haven't seen this show. It came in 15th place and it was viewed by 289,000 whole people. In the same UK, where 4 million people are still watching awful Doctor Who. Stewart had resisted past overtures from Star Trek curious producers when he met in his kitchen with Kurtzman and writers Michael Chabon and Akiva Goldsman in 2017, and there's something about the timing of this meeting that we'll get into a little later in the video. He did so as a courtesy. I explained to them all those elements of Next Generation which belong in Next Generation and why I didn't want to go near them again, he says, but they talked about it in such an interesting way, and they talked about it for a long time. Stewart told the producers no thank you and sent them on their way. Then he had an immediate change of heart, probably after his agent told him how much money CBS was offering, probably because they were desperate, because they knew Star Trek Discovery wasn't the success they've been lying to us about for quite some time. He told his agent to ask Kurtzman to put his ideas in writing. 48 hours later, Kurtzman sent over a more than 30-page packet outlining a possible Picard series. It took Kurtzman 2 days to do that. Well, I guess he had to find some material to lift, in my opinion. Picard finds its hero living in near isolation on a very uncosmic French vineyard. He is retired and estranged from Starfleet, the interstellar navy in which he devoted most of his life. He's haunted by a pair of catastrophes, one personal, the other societal. The death of his android colleague, Lieutenant Commander Data, as seen in Nemesis, and a refugee crisis spawned by the destruction of the planet Romulus, as seen in Abrams' Star Trek. When those two seemingly desperate strands of life cross, Picard returns to action, this time without the backing of Starfleet, whose moral center has shifted. I have a question. If the Countdown comics prior to 2009 Star Trek are canon, what happened to Captain Data, who plays a major part in those comics? I always thought they were. So they just stated that Starfleet's moral center has shifted, and then they say this. Roddenberry believed that in the future human beings would be advanced to the point that they would essentially not have conflict with one another. Their biggest challenges would be external. Stewart, also an executive producer on Picard, insists we are remaining very faithful to Gene Roddenberry's notion of what the future might be like. But rigid adherence to that notion is clearly not what he's here for. Again, if this was William Shatner as an executive producer, I would buy into it. William Shatner has been a fan of Star Trek, has cared about his character. Patrick Stewart hasn't given two shits about Picard for 2 decades. In a way, the world of Next Generation has been too perfect and too protected. No, these hacks can't write something inspiring. They can't write something hopeful. It was the Enterprise. It was a safe world of respect and communication and care and sometimes fun, and we can't have that. In Picard, the Federation, a union of planets bonded by shared democratic values, has taken an isolationist turn. I'm sorry, a union of planets made up of a diverse group of aliens, including Vulcans, has become isolationist in space? The one that went exploring everywhere to seek out new life, new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before and now they're not going there? Only the camp of Bad Reboot and Secret Hideout with Alex Kurtzman could come up with something that dumb, earning the name Star Trek Discovery. The new show, Stewart says, was me responding to a world of Brexit and the Orange Man and feeling, why hasn't the Federation changed? Why hasn't Starfleet changed? Maybe they're not as reliable and trustworthy as we all thought. Remember earlier in the article when they were talking about Paramount Television practically printing money off of the success of Star Trek? This is exactly how not to do that.
They tried to make a biff, bam, pow, woo, let's appeal to the lowest common denominator. Well, Star Trek never did that. Star Trek is not about the lowest common denominator. Now, I understand. Perhaps it is in terms of the audience, but that's never what Star Trek never punches down. It always punches up. Star Trek is a smart show, and it's about smart people doing smart things.
In the week ahead, Stewart will not only perform a Christmas Carol for the first time in more than a decade and a half, he'll also entertain Chabon and Goldsman at his home and hear their pitch for Picard Season 2. Based on the information given in this interview, we are a week away from Sir Patrick Stewart returning to A Christmas Carol. It was supposed to start December 11th, 2019. Within that week, he was going to entertain Akiva Goldsman and Michael Chabon and talk about Star Trek Picard Season 2. On December 10th, 2019, Michael Chabon left Star Trek Picard. Makes you wonder what happened in that meeting. So he was either fired or he quit. It's obviously one or the other. How did they spin it? Oh, he's going off to do a show on his own book, Cavalier and Clay, over at Showtime. I'll be very interested to see if this show actually happens. I will be paying very close attention. Alex Kurtzman's regime at CBS Star Trek has a lot in common with Kathleen Kennedy's regime at Disney Star Wars. A lot of chaos, a lot of panic, a lot of reshoots, a lot of cost overruns, and a lot of employee turnover. But the worst thing they have in common with Disney Star Wars is treading on our modern mythology, the characters we loved, the stories we loved.
The power of that show, the success of that show, the benefits that it gave. I have never, ever grown tired of hearing from people who stop me in the street or in a restaurant who say to me, your show changed my life. Without Star Trek, The Next Generation, I might not be here.
So what the hell, let's shit-can that so we can drop a couple of F-bombs and complain about the Orange Man, because that would be relevant. As I've said before, Hollywood is where trends go to die because they can't act fast enough to actually be relevant. And unfortunately, you're trying to make a show relevant with a 79-year-old lead who had to mention he was poor in his Variety article so he doesn't sound like an old, rich elitist telling us how to live our lives. Unfortunately, that's exactly how he sounds. Sir Patrick Stewart is somebody who still has my respect. I just don't give a crap what he has to say outside of engage. Just as Kathleen Kennedy did with Disney Star Wars, just as James Cameron did with Terminator Derp Fate, they are willing to burn the characters that they helped create, that we loved and helped cultivate, and make them a lot of money, by the way, to make a political point. And Sir Patrick Stewart is just the latest to do this, and he will be the latest to fail at it. And I can't tell you how disappointing it is. But I can tell you this, there are better TV shows out there, better shows for science fiction fans. Instead of watching this garbage that CBS All Access has decided to shovel at us, go on over to Amazon Prime and watch The Expanse. If you haven't seen it, you won't regret it. It's everything that Alex Kurtzman Trek wishes it could be. Or head on over to Hulu and watch Seth MacFarlane's The Orville. Until next time, I hope you have a great day. Please like, share, and subscribe if you like what you heard. If you didn't like what you heard, I appreciate you listening this long. I will see you in the next video.
Nerdrotic.com. Please subscribe.
Bob and Damon were playing louder than I was because they knew Trek much more deeply, much more thoroughly than I did. JJ and I think, had probably more similar interests because we were, frankly, more Star Wars people.